heard Tyler talk about this book on NPR, and I was so impressed with ideas that he was talking about that I went out and bought the book and was even more impressed to ask Tyler if he'd join us. If you haven't read the book, The Complacent Class, The Self-Defeating Quest for the American Dream, I would encourage you to buy it. You don't need to read it, just buy it. And then read it, ideally. Because it's a very interesting, I think, assessment of where America is. And you can ask the question, why are we focused on that as a think tank focused on innovation? And I think the answer is because if you are complacent as a society, it also means that you're complacent about innovation, about risk-taking, about the role of government to set big goals like we did in the 1960s, for example, sending a man to the moon and returning him safely. So I think it has a lot of implications for an innovation agenda. There are also books in the back there, so if you're interested and would like to purchase a copy, I think, Tyler, you're able to sign them.
Sure.
So let me start by introducing Tyler and then our three great respondents. Tyler's going to make some remarks. Each respondent will make some comments. We'll have time for questions, and we'll adjourn no later than 10:30. Tyler is the Holbert Harris Chair of Economics at George Mason University. He also serves as chairman of the Mercatus Center, also at George Mason. He's the co-author of the popular economics blog, Marginal Revolution. He's also written a number of different books, widely quoted in the media, as I'm sure you know. Malcolm Gladwell described the Complacent Class as brilliant. So that means a lot coming from somebody like Gladwell. Ed Luce is the Washington columnist and commentator for the Financial Times. He writes the weekly column, and editorials on American politics and the economy. He's been at FT since 1995. He was also South Asia Bureau Chief in New Delhi and Washington Bureau Chief here as well. Mike Lind is the co-founder of New America, where he's a senior fellow. He's also been an editorial or staff writer at The New Yorker, Harper's, New Republic, and National Interest. His most recent book is The Land of Promise, An Economic History of the United States. If you haven't read that book, I would encourage you to read that excellent book. And finally, joining us from New York with the magic of telepresence is Rehan Salam, who is executive editor and a National Review Institute policy fellow. He's a contributing editor of National Affairs. He's on the board of New America, and he's an advisor to the Energy Innovation Reform Project and the Niskanen Institute. Previously, Salam was an associate editor at The Atlantic, producer for NBC News, editorial researcher at the New York Times. He's also co-author with Ross Duhat of the Grand New Party, How Conservatives Could Win the Working Class and Save the American Dream. So with that, Tyler.
I think of this book as part of a broader project to explain what has gone wrong in America, economically, politically, and socially. And the core arguments of the book spring from a pretty common mechanism in social science. That is the distinction between individual and collective outcomes. So in the implicit model of this book, we have individuals in the United States, each seeking to increase their own level of safety in their lives, to limit risk. They may be fearful, they may be complacent, they may simply desire comfort, they may just be maximizing their utility. Through a number of mechanisms I'll go through, individuals increase their own safety, but at the collective level, this will eventually lead to higher social risk and other undesirable social outcomes. If you know John Maynard Keynes's general theory, this is a pretty standard economic argument. So in Keynes's macroeconomics, when everyone runs for liquidity, trying to be safer, the market collapses and it actually ends up being more volatile and riskier. Thomas Schelling, who was my advisor way back when, also has a number of arguments which outline the distinction between individual behavior and social outcomes. So the way to think about the ways in which we've tried to make our lives safer, I go through them in the book. We can talk about any one of them in more detail. But one typical statistic would be that Americans move across state lines at a much lower rate than they used to. This has fallen almost 50% today compared to the period 1948 to 1971. Some of what I cite in the book is anecdotal. So just the way people raise their children, the extreme level of fear, even at the notion that your children might play outside someday. Whereas even though society is much safer, crime rates are much lower, some number of decades ago you were simply told to, quote unquote, go out and play, and it was hoped you would come back. The rate at which we medicate ourselves could be another example of how we have tried to be safer or slowed down change or limited complacency. If we look at economic data, productivity data, rates of innovation, I won't go through this debate in detail. We've had it here before and in other places. But I would just say, if you look at the data from quantities about the American economy, labor supply and investment, not price data. If there's price data, someone will always tell you, oh, the CPI is mismeasuring progress. Things are better than you think. But if you look at the quantity data, labor force participation or net investment, the quantity data are very much consistent with the view that productivity and innovation are not doing so well. Even if you look at something like the trade deficit, I think that there is a whole, including, I would say, voting behavior, if I may tread on that topic ever so shortly. Also, something like how many Mexicans want to stay in this country rather than leave it. We all know there's actually a slight outflow back to Mexico. Mexican economy is doing okay, but it's not even growing at 3%. So if Mexicans don't find it so worthwhile to stay here, you have to think, well, maybe something in our economy is rather underpowered. Another chapter of the book talks about the bureaucratization of protest. The right of public assembly, as enshrined in our Constitution, has by no means been taken away from us. It's just much costlier to organize a protest. The number of spaces where you can make trouble in some way is much more limited. National security considerations are invoked much more quickly. I have an offshoot piece. It's not in the book. I wrote it for Bloomberg. It argues the fact that food has replaced music as being culturally central is another sign of our complacency. So music could often, or at least it should, make you want to get up and dance. Food actually has somewhat of an effect where you don't want to get up and dance. In excess, it leads to obesity. It calms people down. You drink wine with your food. Food is a kind of all-purpose topic of conversation. The weather is not enough. Sports discriminates against immigrants and sometimes women. But almost everyone can talk about food. It's very non-judgmental. You can say you like the food of a culture and sort of vaguely from a distance mood affiliate with praising that culture without having to actually commit to any specific positive claim on behalf of the culture. Music is more divisive. It used to divide the generations. Now we all listen to the same kinds of music. So what the book is really doing is putting together different areas of American life and trying to find a common thread. And this common thread I describe as complacency. And that's simply the sense that there's no urgent reason we need to change this status quo. So the Complacent Class, that's the title of the book. But the Straussian joke behind that title is we're all the complacent class. So some people think, well, it's the top 1%. Or some people think it's the Hillary Clinton voters. Other people think, well, it's the Donald Trump voters. But it's nearly everyone. I view immigrants as the least complacent class in this country. But even if you look at the lower middle class and you measure variables such as for how long do they live at home rather than striking out on their own, how interested are they in getting driver's licenses or owning cars, how likely are they to protest as compared to playing video games or watching pornography, I think you can argue that even the groups in this country that are probably not so happy or not so content, they are still in some way complacent compared to past eras. So the way the model in this book proceeds is that as complacency builds up, in the short run, life is much more pleasant. So I view much of what is happening as a kind of reaction to the excesses of the 1960s and 70s, which were a very volatile and in many ways unpleasant time. Crime rates were extraordinarily high. Politics was a mess. Richard Nixon tries to violate the Constitution. There's the Vietnam War. an incredible number of bombings and riots. People didn't like that, and they were correct not to like it, so they decided they were going to fix things. You could date that to the early 1980s. I'm very glad they decided to fix things. But I think also this in some ways went too far, that there's a logic to safety, that it is hard to know where to stop. So we have limited social mobility. It's much harder to move into America's most productive cities because of building restrictions. The economy is much more regulated. The notion that the Fed creates a kind of Bernanke put or Yellen put under the stock market. Again, all ways in which people don't want to have to suffer losses. And at some point, what happens is there's a comeuppance. So the comeuppance hasn't quite yet come, but the last chapter of the book is about a comeuppance. And this has really changed my ideas on social progress and also economic growth. So in the 1990s, I very much believed that the good features of the mid to late 90s could more or less go on forever. It wouldn't be the world we wanted. But keep in mind, that was a time people debated when will Russia join the EU, and when, not if, will China become a democracy. To bring up those questions now would be a kind of sick joke, right? Middle-class wage growth in a few of those years was at or close to 3%. The mid-90s are an example of what things look like when it's going fine. So the people who want to revise current data and say it's better than it looks, one of my rebuttals is, well, look at 95 to 98. That's what a healthy economy actually looks like. What a healthier politics looks like. It's not what we have now. So anyway, eventually economic growth, innovation slowed down. Social change in many ways slows down. The internet, I think, has compounded the trend towards safety. The internet, at least so far, I think it has increased the returns to leisure more than making many people productive in the workplace. So you can sit at home, Amazon delivers you packages, and there's Netflix streaming. That's wonderful, I do it too. But it is in fact a form of complacency. I think over time the internet will reshape more and more of our physical world. But it's striking to me, as someone who's now 55 years old, how much most of my physical world has not changed. I took trains New York to Washington in the 1970s. I'm not even sure that it's better now. The drive is worse. And so many features of life, from the sort of narrowly, crudely physical point of view, have stayed still. The airplane experience, I don't just mean United here. But that too, you can debate whether it's better or worse. Like finally, you can use your iPad on a United flight. Maybe that makes it better since deregulation. But until then, actually, I would say it was worse. So we've invested so much in the information space. It's great for people who love information, which is probably everyone here. So we overestimate progress. We're in ailing economies, and ailing economies, resources tend to flock to the most important cities, which is probably everyone here, plus Ryan, in New York. It's not in every way a healthy development, but it does mean elite and intellectual classes who live in these cities, they tend to overrate how good things are. I found it very worthwhile to give versions of various talks, in parts of the Midwest, and I'm Hillary for being an extreme optimist. And that too is enlightening. So what does the comeuppance look like? I outline a few scenarios in the book. I don't really have a prediction as to which one will come first. One is just you can have a debt crisis. I guess that's not my prediction for what comes first, but it's come to some parts of Europe, so in that sense it's come first globally. And complacency is affecting pretty much all of the developed economies. I sometimes say Japan was the pioneer of complacency, just as they were a pioneer of many things. Japan's much more innovative than we think. They innovated complacency in the 90s, and probably they'll do a better job of it than we do. So a debt crisis is one thing that has happened in a few places, maybe will happen in Italy, but it wouldn't be my bet for the United States. Another possibility is that a foreign policy crisis comes along, and the country is unable to respond to that. It could be a question of resources. In this country, it's more likely to be a question of will, a question of having frittered away our alliances, a question of not having made longer-term institutional infrastructure kinds of decisions within the bureaucracy, the State Department, the military, preparing the public with an understanding of what might at some point be needed. That to me seems more plausible to me. I certainly wouldn't say it's happened yet. But you see North Korea, Syria, the Middle East, other trouble points with Russia, China. It seems to me
you could have a challenge to American power, where very suddenly, in a house of cards-like manner, people would all of a sudden realize we're just not very credible.
And probably that would ultimately come from the voters, whatever you might want to blame individual politicians for. That's one possible scenario. Another possible scenario that I see a few tiny signs of is governance becoming more dysfunctional. People are sorting themselves more into, one kind of area or the other. So at Santa Monica, Arlington, Virginia, and Ann Arbor, Michigan, they're now
Scarily alike in some ways. You can drive all the way across country, one ocean to the other, and not go through a single Hillary Clinton county. Yet in Washington, D.C., Trump wins only 4.3% of the vote, and I have good friends who don't know a single Trump voter, period. So when that's the way your world is, my suspicion is your politics will go very badly, and your governance will be quite dysfunctional. How much we're seeing that now, not the point of the session, but I would say we're, at the very least, in a somewhat unorthodox situation with further change coming. So my theory of history is now more, I would say, of a cyclical one. The very good periods tend to be followed by periods of chaos rather than being self-cementing. It's interesting to compare this to Manker-Olson. So Olson had a kind of mean reversion in his theory of interest groups. Things are too good for too long and the interest groups pile up and then you grow more slowly. I like that book. I loved Manker-Olson. My hypothesis is a little different. So for Olson, I think it's about the interest groups. It's like small number trade associations just finally strangled K Street, or at 1101 K Street for any of you watching online. I don't actually think that's the way it's been happening or is going to happen. That is a problem, to be sure. But in my model, it's a kind of mimetic desire and copying and cultural effect across citizens. People see other people choosing more safety, and they see in the short run it works for those people, and they copy them. So it's only interest groups in the sense that we're all an interest group. We're virtually all culpable. I sometimes joke my response to a problem with excess complacency was to write a book about it. It's a somewhat complacent response. I didn't go out and throw a brick. So I think of authors' books so often they're actually about the author himself or herself. Always try to read a book at that level. Just say, it's the person writing about themselves. Maybe in some way they are. So the interest group here is all the citizens. It's a cultural-wide phenomenon. The thinker who anticipated this idea most clearly, as I say in the book, was Tocqueville, even though he wrote really quite a long time ago, in the early to middle part of the 19th century. The notion that American conformity through seeking to be too comfortable could lead us into a new mediocrity. I would say he was more right than he ever could have imagined. There's much more to say, but I think my time for now is up. And now we turn it over to the commentators. And thank you all for coming. Thank you, all three of you, in advance for your comments.
Great, thank you, Tyler. Ed.
Thank you, Rob, for inviting me out. One of the last events I did here, I always enjoyed being here, was in fact with Tyler's previous book, Book 1, The Great Stagnation, which I'd like to refer to in a moment. But that was a great summary of a really good book. I agree with Rob, you should buy it, but not just buy it, you should read it. Before I make the 2 or 3 points I want to make about this book and questions I have about it, let me just say it's immensely refreshing to have an economist who doesn't wait for the data. Because economists wait for data like people in London wait for the number 137 bus. And it takes a long time and then 3 of them come along at the same time. They're always late, they're always behind the curve. Tyler isn't inhibited by those academic structures, and I think we're the richer for it. I used to work for Larry Summers and write speeches for him, and he always insisted on inserting the joke. I became an economist because I lacked the personality to be an accountant. And you don't say that of Tyler. Tyler could be a food critic. Well, he is a food critic, but he's a film buff. He's a sociologist, he's many things. A travel writer, actually, might be a better designation. And I think that allows him to bring in sort of insights and intuition to the data that provides a very different perspective than you would expect from most economists. Economics, as you know, was originally political economy. Well, in fact, originally it was a branch of philosophy, then became political economy, and has morphed, I think, to its great impoverishment into sort of an abstruse branch of mathematics in many faculties across the world. And so I find it very refreshing to have an omnivorous economist and a multidisciplinary one. And a book like this couldn't be done with the data. This does involve insights, it involves leaps of judgment, and essentially what Tyler is doing, what you're doing with this book, is making an intuitive reading of America's spirit, which is about as far as you can get from a conventional economics book. And that's its great strength. It's also potentially its weakness, because of course you can't disprove your thesis. It's unfalsifiable in a way. But I happen to believe it's mostly correct. So let me make three brief points about this. The first is about the spirit you identify of modern America, namely one of risk aversion, one of conformism, one of actually declining individualism in spite of what we think, in spite of appearances. And I think you do a brilliant job of showing how in our increasingly internet-dominated lives we reduce the scope for risk, we reduce the scope for serendipity, for chance in our lives. Our love lives are governed by algorithms. Assorted mating, as it's called, has become the standard, at least for the elites, way of finding a romantic partner. The scope for companies to screen out people with any kind of misfit pieces in their history that they can search for very easily and find on social media and elsewhere, makes us more risk averse in terms of job applications. Companies don't want eccentrics, they're too high risk. And companies, of course, as you mentioned in your book, themselves are investing not so much in R&D and the discoveries of tomorrow as they are in share buybacks and dividends to shareholders, which is an immensely risk averse form of behavior at the corporate level. And which are their departments that are growing? It's the HR departments and the legal departments, the compliance departments that are growing at a time of really heavy profitability, when companies really could be putting a lot more money into the serendipity of R&D. And so you make that point very well, and of course it applies to the political sphere too. That people who want to make it in public life had better make sure they don't say anything that can be taken out of context, because unless you're Trump, of course, there is a massive exception. Or indeed be nominated to the Supreme Court. It's not just those running for election. The risk aversion, this is a systemic caution about what you say, because you know it will be found, is quite rationally governing how people behave, people with public ambition behave. And so I think you make that point very well, and I think you do capture that spirit. As an interesting little factoid, your book is full of really interesting bits of data, but the one that I took was that in one of the years in the late 60s and early 70s, I can't remember which, in one single year there were 2,500 bombings in America. 2,500 bombings, the weather, the underground, the Black Panthers, the various groups. And it became sort of quite normal. I think 2 bombings would be enough to frighten the living daylights out of us today. We are just much more easily panicked. So the question I have in terms of conformism, this is my first of 3 questions, I'll make the next 2 briefer, is whether this decline in risk-taking and entrepreneurship and business formation, small business startup formation, which is measurable and is clearly happening, whether this decline is to do with that spirit that you've laid out so well in your book, or simply because we're getting older. I think when you get older, you take fewer risks, and America is aging. And I think that sort of demographic trend is a large part of this. So that's a question. My second point with a question attached is about productivity. So, as I mentioned, your wonderful short book, The Great Stagnation, I think has been borne out in the 5 or 6 years since you wrote it. American productivity growth hasn't taken off. And by and large, Tyler, correct me if I'm mischaracterizing you, but by and large, you are still on the pessimistic side about productivity growth. And I know you have...
But not forever.
Not forever. I know you believe at some point. But if just stick to you being still on the pessimistic side for a second, the Robert Gordon view that, or the Peter Thiel view that we expected flying cars and all we got was 140 characters. That famous saying that the middle class stagnation that we've been seeing, the declining income mobility that we've been seeing, and the rising inequality, this sort of triple cocktail, is associated partly with an era of low productivity growth. But if the optimistic view is correct, namely that we are suddenly at some point when the human genome, comes to certain fruition, or the unicorns in Silicon Valley, one of them is really transformative, at some point get back to the annual productivity growth that we saw in the 50s, 60s, 70s, early 70s, then in a way that's, although it's the optimistic scenario, that's an even more bleak one for most Americans, because they're middle skilled. And that means the robots are going to take more of their jobs more rapidly. So I suppose it's, if healthcare and education, the two great sectors that haven't really been transformed by productivity revolution, but that are the generators of the most amount of jobs, if those are ready to be Ubered, then we've got a really massive, massive crisis on our hands. And the sort of the most disturbing statistic I know of is that there are now more people employed either full or part-time behind the wheel as truck drivers, Uber drivers, delivery drivers, etc., than there are in manufacturing. And most of them are male, and we know what happens when, there's a very male quality to our politics right now. So even if the optimistic scenario, or especially if the optimistic scenario on productivity growth is correct, what is your solution? I mean, you are many things, but you're also an economist, and that means you have policy solutions. And one thing that I think is missing from your book is a remedy to this. You mentioned things like universal basic income, but I'd like to hear more about that. And the third and final point is about history, which you touched on in your talk. And Tyler makes a very radical claim that history isn't linear, it's circular. There's nothing closer to a Western religion than the idea of progress. And it's shared across the board by all forms of Western ideology, the Christians with the Millennial Day, the Marxists, of course, with the ending of the withering away of the state, and most importantly, liberals, and particularly American liberals, the march towards ever-perfect union. We all have inbuilt in us this sense that history is progressing towards a happier place. And Tyler questions that. Tyler says actually maybe we are in a circular form of history in which we just repeat human follies. And the technology might get better and we might be less poor, but essentially we just keep repeating our moral failures. And my question, and you might well be right, I think you probably are, but my question is, can we stand knowing that? Are we capable of understanding this and remaining sane? Because our entire societies, and particularly America, is built on the fundamental upward slope view of towards ever-perfect union. And so I guess that I'll leave with that, because I've got plenty of things to say, but I'll leave it with that question as well. Can our sanities withstand that?
There's always denial.
There's always denial, the Egyptian river.
Michael.
Well, so that's a lot of space to cover. Children's play practices, the shape of history, and productivity growth. As a former free-range child, I agree entirely about these pampered youngins nowadays. As for the shape of history, I think it's a sine curve, not an asymptotic curve or a circle, but that will have to wait for another day. I just want to bring out my differences with Tyler Cowen on the roles of interstate mobility and startups in productivity growth and economic growth. And it's not simply with him, but with much of current conversation, which puts great emphasis on the number of startups and on geographic mobility. There's many other aspects of this analysis, particularly of society, that I think are quite insightful, but I'm just going to concentrate on what I disagree with. So to begin with geographic mobility, if you look at rates of labor productivity growth and total factor productivity growth, the U.S. is always in the top 4 or 5 in international rankings. The others are mostly European countries, sometimes small ones, Switzerland, Luxembourg, but also Germany. Japan's up there. South Korea is very low labor productivity growth. So in relative terms, we're not falling behind the rest of the world. Well, I'll get to the absolute growth in a second. But so in relative times, we're still near the top, which is pretty good for an enormously diverse continental country that's the third most populous nation in the world. And all of the other ones up there are fairly homogeneous European or East Asian countries. So if I looked at the correlation between labor productivity and geographic mobility, and it turns out, as you would expect, that the countries that have the most geographic mobility are the big ones. So essentially, the U.S., Canada, and Australia have much more geographic mobility than other countries of similar productivity growth, which are small. Moving from Bavaria to Schwabia, it's just not that far compared to across the U.S. So it is definitely the case that overall productivity growth is lower than it was up until about 2004, and it's just collapsed since the Great Recession. But again, this is a global phenomenon. And so the question I would ask is, how can you explain a global phenomenon in terms of the culture of a particular country? Now, in his remarks, Tyler said, well, the Japanese are complacent, the Europeans are complacent. But, if it explains everything, it doesn't necessarily explain anything. And I'll get to what I think the real explanation is, and inspired partly by your previous book, The Great Stagnation. So there's another aspect to the elite conversation, particularly about geographic mobility, that I want to just spend just a second on. Tyler Cowen quotes Enrico Moretti and Changtai CA, who did a very influential study of the role of agglomeration and of geographic mobility, and argued that you could raise U.S. productivity like 9.5% or something like that. If there were lower housing costs in San Francisco and the Bay Area, so people could move there and take it part in New York and so on. Well, here's the problem with that. If you actually read this paper, which has been incredibly influential, it's just quoted by pundits and bloggers, and there's this whole cottage industry about how if you lowered rents in San Francisco, U.S. productivity would go up. If you read the paper, it's ridiculous. It's nonsensical, because they have a paragraph in there, and they say, of course, we're making the unrealistic assumption of inter-industry mobility. And they go on to say, we're assuming, this is Moretti and CA, that there's no problem with a laid-off automobile worker joining a tech firm in San Francisco. They say that in the paper. Read the paper. But they say, even though this is unrealistic, we feel that over time, skills will adjust to make this outcome. So the entire intellectual fabric that this is based on, this to the extent it's based on this paper, is based on essentially nonsense. Saying that essentially the laid-off automobile worker in Detroit, and they use the example, Detroit is going to move to San Francisco and join a tech firm, instead of being competing with the janitors were being unemployed in San Francisco. If you look at the rates of interstate mobility, Tyler knows this as a qualification when he writes about this. I think the real reason for a lot of this is convergence. I have, through my sister-in-law, African-American in-laws who fled Texas in the part of the Great Migration, went to Pennsylvania, and then they came back after the Civil Rights Revolution and flourishing life in Houston. So if you look at the mid-20th century, a lot of the turmoil, in my view, had nothing whatsoever to do with the personal character and lack of complacency of individuals. There were these huge push factors, right, that led white Southerners and black Southerners to migrate to the industrial cities of the Northeast. You had the Sun Belt, where companies transferred production to my native state of Texas because it was anti-union, right? So that the jobs came up, and then you had the migration to California, which was driven by infrastructure development. The fact is, if you're working class right now, and you graduate from high school, and that's 70% of the U.S. population, most of the jobs you're likely to get, since most jobs for people with high school diplomas are in the non-traded domestic service sector, they're in your hometown. I mean, if you're in Akron, Ohio, you can work at Akron Mall. There's no reason to move to Houston working in a mall or California working in a mall. And to the extent you do have movement for working class people, it's to cheaper rent areas, lower rent areas, mostly in the South. And this is something else that amuses me about the public discussion as a Texan. You would think, from reading all the intellectuals and listening to NPR, that there are two regions in the United States. There's the coasts, which are a bunch of rich people, and then there's the devastated Appalachian Midwest, and it's a total disaster. Almost all of the interstate migration in the United States is from the coasts and the Midwest and Appalachia to the South, from Texas to North Carolina and Virginia. It's massive migration. So anyway, that's why I'm skeptical about the interstate mobility. And very briefly, on the startups, the Schumpeterian theory of technological innovation, the idea that there are waves based on general purpose technologies like the car, the electric motor, ICT, I think explains productivity trends much, much better than any kind of psychological, cultural explanation. If you look at 1947 to 73, we had very high productivity growth. It's like 2.5, almost 3% sometimes. Then again, in 1995 to 2004, and Tyler Cowen has written about this before, we get this uptick in productivity growth. Between these waves of productivity growth, we get these troughs. One is from 73 to 95, the other starts in 2004. And this is more or less global, it's different rates in different countries. To my mind, the idea that these upward waves represent the installation of technologies like automobiles and electricity, and then when you pluck the low-hanging fruit of getting everybody in your country an automobile and rural electrification, then you get lower productivity for a while, and it's just harder in the so-called installation phase. The ICT installation, information and communications technology, I think perfectly explains the 95 to 2004 uptick, and then the trough that we're in. So just in terms of policy recommendations, while I agree with much of Tyler Cowen's social analysis, I think if you want to boost productivity growth, you boost productivity growth. It's like Napoleon said, if you want to invade Vienna, invade Vienna. And the way you do that is by focusing mainly on technology, not on the character of Americans and so on. And just one more point, the startups. In 1900, there were about 100 automobile companies. In the 30s, there were about a dozen. By the 1950s, there were the big three. What you see as technologies mature and increasing returns industries is the big ones. You tend to move towards an oligopoly. So the decline in startups as a technology matures is to be expected. And I don't think the country would have been better off if we had more automobile startups in 1960 or more aerospace startups in 1970, these are naturally oligopolistic industries. But those are my quibbles with an otherwise fascinating book, which I encourage everyone to read.
Great. Thank you, Mike. Rehan.
Hi, everyone. It's great to be here, or rather to have a robot be in the room with you while I'm sitting here at a table. I want to chat a little bit about the future and about Tyler's thoughts, his speculations as to how we might break out of this complacent class pattern. There are lots of different sources of this complacency. Much of it is cultural, and of course some of it relates to our political institutions, the dysfunction of those political institutions. So I just want to offer a few brief speculative thoughts. At one point, Tyler talks about the possibility that we might start seeing larger families in the future if you see more outsourcing of household production of machines and what have you, in a larger cultural turn. You also see an emerging conversation among Orthodox Christians who are talking about pursuing a Benedict option, this idea of withdrawal from a culture, a post-Christian culture they consider to be lacking in the kind of spiritual values that they hold dearest. And so that's one interesting possibility. There's a paper by two sociologists, Alex Kevern and Jeremy Fries, published a few years back on differential fertility and how it shapes public opinion. Specifically, they were observing that when you look at most social issues, younger people are more socially liberal than their elders. There's one big exception, which is abortion. On abortion, younger people are roughly as conservative as older generations. So not more conservative, certainly, but you've seen some stability there, which is a break with other things. And they posit that the reason for that could be that people who are anti-abortion have larger families, and the children of those parents, there tends to be a correlation between the views of the parents and the child. So that's one little issue where that might be true, but one wonders if there might be other ways in which the children of larger families have different views and different sensibilities. And when you look at younger generations, a bigger chunk of them is likely to come from those somewhat idiosyncratic larger families. This is a cultural force that we don't think about all that often, particularly because when we look at our culture, we see this general trend toward greater secularism, greater liberalism. But it's possible that we will see this really dramatic turn that will come 15, 20 years from now, as some of these larger, more religiously observant families, as their children come of age and play a larger role in our culture. Something to think about, something that would potentially break us out of our complacency. Another thought is, when you're looking at complacency on the political side, much of this, as Tyler would surely acknowledge, is a reflection of the fact that we have less and less fiscal space, and an issue that Tyler does touch on in the book. So when you have an aging population, it's not at all surprising that a larger share of expenditures, public expenditures, will be devoted to providing for the aged. And I think in a way we're actually underestimating what this is likely to look like over the next 15 to 20 years. For example, when you look at the long-term care challenge, we're underestimating how much we'll need to spend on long-term care because family structure looks so different. You have a large number of aging baby boomers who don't have very strong ties to family, that have very small numbers of children themselves. So many of these kind of informal institutions that help cushion the blow of aging are not going to be there for older people. And it's very striking to me when you look at both the debate over the Affordable Care Act and the American Health Care Act, you didn't really see much of a conversation about long-term care. Under the Affordable Care Act, you had a provision known as the Class Act, and the idea there was that, okay, we're going to provide for long-term care in this way that everyone knew was very, very unrealistic, but it's something that generated some revenue, and so it made it look a bit more as though the Affordable Care Act was deficit improving. And then within about a year and a half of the law's passage, this provision was abandoned. More recently, with the American Health Care Act, when you look at the politics of Medicaid and cutting future federal funding for Medicaid, the thing that was never explicitly discussed is that one big reason there's so much pushback to this is that almost 40% of Medicaid funds go to the so-called dual eligibles, people who are eligible for Medicaid but also eligible for Medicare. And many of these people are really middle-class people, upper-middle-income people who spent down their assets because they're desperate and they're in need. They're in need of money for long-term care that really no one anticipated. So the expectation that state governments would bear this cost was very unrealistic, but state governments are bearing more and more of this cost. So one way to think about it is that our complacency leads us to not want to bite the bullet. Everyone knows that we are not going to let elderly people starve. We are going to provide them with long-term care. No one wants to acknowledge that someone is going to have to pay for it. So we pretend that state governments are going to pay for it. That is, we don't have the federal government simply take this over from the states. And that puts us in this weird bind. So what you see happen routinely is you will have the passage of federal laws that will say, we will restrict spending in this way. The federal government will adhere to this rigorous standard where spending will only increase by X% a year. Then that's never actually honored in practice. Every year we have a different kind of doc fix. Because of course we do, because actually, physicians, hospitals, they're politically influential. Of course we're actually going to keep the lights on, because in many American cities, including some of these more depressed cities and more depressed regions of the country, are cities where pretty much economic activity flows from the hospital sector, flows from the education sector, sectors that are very heavily subsidized by government. So one way to break out of complacency might be simply acknowledging that we are going to bear these costs, and that the period over the next 15 to 20 years is going to have to be a period in which we just have to get through this kind of crisis. And that by the time you get past the 2030s, then suddenly you're going to have breathing room. They're going to start having a bit more fiscal space. So perhaps we ought to think about this as a crisis period that we need to get through, and we need to start coalescing in some way to get around it. When you look at the emergence of the kind of growth-oriented social democracies in post-war Europe, in a way they were dealing with the challenge of American hyperproductivity. They were dealing with the fact that their industrial bases had been devastated by the Second World War. And so you had all of these cross-class compromises that were struck. Now, certainly, the aging of the population is not nearly as dramatic as being devastated in war, but it is something I believe that's going to require a level of creativity to create that kind of fiscal space. And that if you have the federal government move and acknowledge, we are going to do this, we're going to deal with these problems, then suddenly state governments are able to be meaningfully different and distinct. They're able to compete in meaningful ways. And I think that that could be something that would be very promising for breaking out of this unhealthy dynamic. So those are a couple of thoughts about how you might see public policy change if we were to kind of confront these realities about our fiscal future. One final thought I'll throw out, also relating to this demographic future, is that when you think about the dying of the baby boom generation, it's going to have a number of knock-on consequences. So one is going to be this quote-unquote happy consequence of easing some of the fiscal burdens on the public sector of the United States. But another consequence is that we will see the transfer of something on the order of $30 to $40 trillion in wealth from baby boomers to their children. That is an extraordinary transfer of wealth that could lead to huge changes in our culture and our society. But there's another dimension to it too, which is that most of the older folks who've accumulated wealth are people who are themselves college educated, they're largely white, and they tend to be concentrated in some of these affluent metropolitan areas that both Mike and Tyler have talked about in their addresses. So it's really interesting to think about what might happen in a generation that is majority non-white, in which a very high proportion consists of people who are the children of less skilled immigrants, other people who haven't necessarily accumulated a large amount in the way of wealth and resources. And what the politics of that big, massive wealth transfer will look like if the beneficiaries of that wealth transfer are overwhelmingly the children of college-educated white natives. I suspect that those politics could be very ugly unless we have some kind of vision of coming together, some kind of vision in which let's try to consolidate the country, let's try to bring people together around some kind of meaningful cross-class compromise. So that's why I think that actually this idea of a cross-class compromise is really, really important, and it's something that we neglect in a very polarized politics in which it's much more one-sided waging war on the other.
Great. Okay.
Beautiful, thank you. Well, thank you. So, by the way, just on that point, there was a good article in the Washington Post this morning on a study, reporting on a study looking at African-American college-educated wealth declines. That goes right to Ray Hunt's point. Tyler, I want to turn over to you, but before I do that, just a couple of quick points. I'm old, but I'm not complacent. I mean, when I get angry, I tweet. I tweet twice. But no, more seriously, I really am amazed at how people are complacent about things. I mean, I ride my bike to work, thank God, but occasionally I will have to drive, and I'm just constantly amazed that people aren't with pitchforks at their state capitol saying, what the heck is going on here? Why have we let our road system get this awful? I mean, I don't know how people deal with it. Because to me, it's a fixable thing, a thing we just become complacent with. I see the same thing with our schools.
Metro.
With Metro. I mean, Metro's to the point of where, I hate taking the Metro, and it just keeps getting a little worse, but we kind of don't know it, and we're complacent about it. And then, you know, on broader levels, regional distress, you know, parts of our economy, our country, regionally, that we've just decided we're complacent about. It's a natural sort of fate. Productivity. Even this other one, I think about, you know, maybe pushing back a little bit on Ed, you know, I feel like we've become so complacent that we cannot contemplate for one single moment that a truck driver could lose his job. Oh my God, this is like, we need a national program because a truck driver might lose their job. I think what we're forgetting there is, we have a new study coming out in 2 weeks where we've looked at occupational churning from the 1850s to the present. The last 15 years have been the lowest rate of occupational churn of any decade in American history. So the odds of losing your job today are so low compared to what they used to be. They're just from getting a layoff or a downsizing or a closure now, 20% less than just 15 or 20 years ago. But we're sort of complacent about that. We can't, that risk is too great to take. We can't have any job loss. So I'd just be curious both to that and then also to the other three, the three main responses. What are your thoughts?
Many remarks. First on solutions. The book deliberately does not have solutions. I've learned readers don't like solutions in a book. So they focus on disagreeing with the solutions and they neglect the basic idea. So I always package the solutions separately. Another reason to package them separately is there may not be any. I write 2 columns a week and blog every day. The subtitle of Marginal Revolution is Small Steps Toward a Much Better World. Those are my solutions. I'm not sure how good they are. I think the more important point is that we're not very interested in solutions. So in this sense, I think there are no solutions. There's plenty good laundry list of what we ought to do. So I disagree with Michael comparing it to invading Vienna. We'll just do it, invest in technology. I agree we should do that, but the question is why haven't we, why don't we, why do we tolerate everything Rob just mentioned? I think that is ultimately a cultural issue. It's not really a global phenomenon, but it does apply to most of the countries on the technological frontier, Western Europe and Japan. Canada and Australia, slight exceptions, because they've sold more to China, but in the long run, I don't think they will be. Both Ed and Michael mentioned startups. A mere decline in the number of startups is maybe not such a big deal, but I would know 2 things. First, when you tell people this, they literally don't believe you. I've had people, economists, but also radio talk show hosts say, I don't believe that startups are down. It goes against everything I've read in Wired magazine. Just telling people startups as a percentage are down is a useful corrective. But also note there are other figures about startups, such as the percentage of startups that become unicorns is also down. So when you look at everything we know about the numbers put together, I think it's a more negative picture than just saying, well, startups are down. I agree with that some of this is because we're older. I don't think we know how much. But in general, I don't think these are simply demographic phenomena. 2 things I left out of the book. One should always leave some things out. They're mentioned in passing. One is religion. One is the feminization of society. There are 2 other major forces behind growing complacency. I just didn't want the book to cover too many topics. But other than immigrants, a major non-complacent class in America, I would say, are Mormons. If you feel that someday you're going to be ruling planets, you may be more inclined to get your act together. I think this is great. I've written plenty in defense of Mormonism, not being a Mormon myself. And in general, I worry that this country is becoming more secular, at least in the numbers I see. Feminization of society, that to me also points in a cultural direction. In terms of Ryan's worries about our future, I worry about growing secularism, that TFR may stay around 1.8, which at some but not all recent times it has sunk down to.
Do you want to explain what that means?
How many kids people are having, total fertility in essence.
Ideally, I would say you want something like 2.2 for a country like the US.
At 2, you're more or less breaking even. At 1.8, it's hardly a catastrophe. Italy, I believe, is 1.3.
Singaporean Chinese are about the lowest at 1.1.
1.8 we can manage, but it's not what I'm looking for. I'd love to see us get that up to 2.1. I'm not so worried about ethnic conflict and future politics. I think Latinos increasingly are identifying and will identify as white. According to some sources, I'm not sure how much to trust them, 30% of Latinos already voted for Donald Trump this time around. And they're the single largest originally outside group. And if more and more Latinos identify as white, I do think there's some center that will hold in that, in that regard. I'm much more convinced on geographic mobility than is Michael Lind. He criticizes the Moretti paper. I would stress there are multiple other sources that give you more or less the same result. So read Ryan Avent, for instance, on mobility. I don't completely agree with Ryan's estimate either. But if you do it worker by worker, adjusting for everything we can measure, there's a 40% wage gap between city and non-city. No, I don't think that literally means you can shuffle a worker into the city and the real wage goes up by 40%. I believe there are significant unobservables behind who is living in the city. But there are a lot of other estimates on how much productivity goes up in urban areas that don't rely on the particular assumptions of Moretti.
And they all indicate there are pretty high gains if you can get your cities to work well and take in more people.
Ed asks what will happen when tech really comes to healthcare and education. Good or bad news as someone working in higher ed is I don't really see that around the corner. So eventually it will indeed happen. But those jobs, for better or worse, are pretty much protected for quite a while to come. I worry how many male workers will develop self-identities that will allow them to accept jobs caring for the elderly. Those I don't think will be mechanized anytime soon. I don't know how culturally flexible that group of people will be. Ed asks, can we stand knowing about the possible cyclicality or sine wave nature or otherwise non-linearity of our future progress? I would say no. It's a truth better left buried. I feel bad for having written this book, but there's just things I want to say, and I don't actually think this is going to cause social order to collapse. It may not lead to a single brick being thrown, for better or worse, but I do think it is somewhat of a dangerous idea that what people believed in the 90s had good consequences. But I think there's also a dilemma. So in the world today, most countries are not complacent. And the example I give in the book, the easiest, simplest example to see, is China. Obviously, the rate of growth in China has been pretty amazing. Rates of upward mobility for all the corruption. In my opinion, it's a relatively, actually, meritocratic society. And to grow it, 7 to 10% for now, almost 40 years running. Okay, you don't believe some of the recent numbers, I don't either, but still, that's an almost unparalleled example of systematic non-complacency. But very few people, even if they could, would migrate from the US to China. Like they might have a special job working for a multinational. But people just don't get up and say, oh, I want to go live in China, everything is so much nicer there. The level of income volatility there is extreme. Ability to buy your way out of it by getting the right kind of health care lined up in advance is not very reliable. You're always having to pay bribes again or, reinsure yourself in various implicit ways. So, let's not forget, people like complacency, and for the most part, they ought to. It's just there's a poisonous sting at the end of it all. Ultimately, my message is an optimistic one. I say the sting is probably coming pretty soon, and I want people to see the broader picture so they see way out there, and if they would think more about the longer run optimism based on all the human talent in this country, and a bit less on this sting, they could be more optimistic, but in fact they're going to go away being more pessimistic, and that's dangerous. I know I didn't cover all the points, but that would just be a few responses.
So I wanted to open up, but before I do that, in a way, complacency is there's an externality. complacency. It makes sense for me to be complacent, but if we're all complacent, then the system underperforms.
As with investing, if everyone thinks the efficient markets hypothesis is true, then it's not.
The other thing I liked about your book, I liked your example when you were a kid and you got hit by a ball or something, a dodgeball, which is now illegal in the U.S. Schools. The coach told you to suck it up. At my kid's school, they banned tag on recess field because it was too dangerous. That tells you a lot about how we become risk averse. So I'm going to do in the corner. I see it if you just identify yourself.
Gideon Rackman, Ed's colleague from the FT. I just want to make, Gideon Rackman, Ed's colleague from the FT. I just wanted to pick up on that very last point you made about China and its relative tolerance or lack of complacency. And I wonder whether it's because they've come from such a turbulent time that if you lived through the Cultural Revolution, your knowledge that you can't take security for granted, that turmoil may be inbuilt and that actually can lead to better things, that people have got a higher tolerance for risk in China. And also, sorry, last point, because one of the things the people say in the West about why China wouldn't innovate was they said, oh, well, because it's a closed society, they censor and so on, therefore we're always going to have the edge. But if you're right that it's to do with cultural attitudes and tolerance of risk, maybe that might give one a more optimistic view about China's ability to innovate.
I think another reason they're less complacent is there's literally no way to avoid risk in China. You could be one of the 10 wealthiest people in the country. You then might actually face a higher level of risk.
Sure.
So if you know risk is coming at you anyway, you'll never feel dug in. You develop a psychological coping mechanism for somehow accepting risk, mobilizing the risk, fear of risk to your advantage. It's interesting, I've done 3 interviews with Chinese media outlets about this book. And they all seem very interested in it, and they all ask, we're terrified that we're about to fall into your kind of complacency. That may, in fact, reflect their non-complacency, that they're terrified of it. But it's an interesting way to view the difference.
Yes, sir, right here.
Yeah, hi, I'm Ed Gerwin. I'm the trade fellow with the Progressive Policy Institute, and I haven't read your book, and I'm very much looking forward to it. I have a question about how technology might actually enable us or empower people to assume more risk, whether it can be a positive factor for a more risk-taking society. One of the things I've worked on quite a bit is on a small business exporting. And one of the things that you see, if you look at the numbers, is that only 1 to 5% of American small businesses export. But then if you look at digitally enabled small businesses, folks who trade, for example, on eBay, something like 97% of them export. Now granted, the internet and eBay gives them some comfort in taking those risks, but it is risky to try to sell your products or services in a foreign market. Are there other examples that you can think of how technology could help us get out of this complacency and empower people to assume more risk and drive a more dynamic economy?
Well, I think the internet eventually will prove to be what Michael referred to as a general purpose technology. So far, I'm pretty sure it has not been that way. What's striking about exports, though, is how much exports are predicted by social network connections. And maybe that's counterintuitive in a high-tech age, but we haven't gotten around that yet. And if you graph that over the last 40 years, it's actually not becoming less significant. Arguably, it's becoming slightly more significant. So I think we have a long way to go. It's a kind of race. On one side of the race is how long will it take for tech to become the truly wonderful thing we expect from it. And on the other side of the race is our complacency, which is super slow and leading to other institutions disintegrating. So there exists a scenario where the tech runs so quickly, we leap back up to how things were in the mid-90s, and everything's fine, we balance the budget, all the interest groups are paid off, and we elect like the smartest president you could imagine. Could happen. It's not what I expect, but it's there.
Hi, thank you. I was just wondering. I'm just intrigued by you saying complacency is a cultural aspect, and that's affecting the productivity. And I wonder to what extent it's also mostly institutional, in the sense that taking risk has just become very expensive, even for individuals. So you have the liability regime that is enormous. And even from what you talk about, I have a daughter, and I would send her with the metro somewhere else, and she spends a day doing something. But if something happens, I'm going to be pillared, even in the public space, being a bad mother. So you don't do it not because you don't think, because you think it's a bad thing, just because the risk, the personal risk of doing it is too high. And so, and another example, for example, my daughter got an accident in sports, and her fingers were blue. And so I did what I did when I was a kid, so we're going to wait a week and see what happens. And I got called by the school, you have to go to the hospital and have an x-ray, which turned out to be completely unnecessary. And so you are forced not to take a risk because the price of taking a risk is too high. And so there's a very institutionalized, safe playing, safe playing norms. There are very institutionalized safe playing norms that cut a little bit this risk taking and the other thing that might reinforce that is the enormous prevalence of processes, and that's again something you see in the health sector, or that no matter what happens, they put a process that you have to go through no matter what, and so there's no individualization, there's no customization, there's no invention, creativity. So I think there's a lot of institutional governance aspects that make people very risk averse and very uncreative. So it's not only cultural.
I agree with that completely. Liability law, bureaucratization, but still the fact that we tolerate this is, in my opinion, cultural. There's no political candidate out there running on changing these features of our society. They're not running on it and losing. They're not running on it, period. And I would stress just how much this book stems out of my multiple visits to China. And I thought, there's so many books comparing the United States and some idea of Western Europe. It's time to write a book about the U.S. In some ways, as if someone from China were writing it. How would they see us? And that's a way of thinking about what this book is. And they see it as cultural, like who we are, what we are. And they get, the law matters, bureaucratization. But it's our vision of ourselves at the bottom of it.
Lady right back there with her hand up. Yeah, I'm going in the order I see them.
All right, I'm going to stand up so you can see me. Emily Weiner, Third Way. I've been thinking a lot about geographic mobility as well. I've been doing some research on the concentration of venture capital, and I've also come across them already and see a paper. And I'm wondering that if we followed their advice, would it contribute to more of the self-segregation that you write about in the book as being such a problem? I know I've done it myself. I moved from my home state to Washington, D.C. because I thought it'd be more productive here. Would that just become worse?
I think that will become worse. I can't imagine there's a deregulation of building we will do that will outrace the speed at which we're making it worse. So segregation by income, which I consider the most fundamental form of current segregation, has gone up dramatically since the early 1990s. As a result, many other kinds of segregation go up too. By education, the racial story is tricky, but along some but not all metrics, racial segregation is going up. What I see on the table as cures are so piddling relative to how strongly we are sorted. I think, 20 years from now, America is almost certainly much more sorted. And even areas that pretend to be in some way diverse. I said this in Silicon Valley a few weeks ago. I said, you all have a kind of monoculture of diversity. You're all diverse in the same way. With the diverse people who fit your monoculture. So on paper, you're fully represented, but you're the least diverse part of America. Another way to think about it, people who are wrong, almost by definition, are in some ways more diverse than people who are right. And we so valorize people being right in some way that we define. So Trump voters, I would say, if you're not a Trump supporter, I was not, Trump voters are more diverse than Hillary Clinton voters. They're sort of wrong in a much more varied set of ways. Those groups of people are wrong. But try to sit down with Trump voters and get common agreement, way harder than with Clinton voters. Yet in the media, you hear exactly the opposite story.
Right here.
Thank you, Jean-François. I look forward to reading your book. But trying to build on what you said about Japan behind the pioneer of complacency.
Behind what?
Japan behind the pioneer of complacency.
Oh, yes.
And isn't it all tied to demographics? And also, equal to what Raymond said, but the huge share of healthcare in the US GDP, or for that matter, Western European GDPs and so on. And second question, if it's tied to demographics.
You've got time for just one question. Sorry, there are a lot of people with hands up. Just one.
Isn't there a very easy way to correct that? Sorry. Which is to, at the opposite of the Chinese system, you need to have 3 children to get tax benefits.
Clearly, some of it is demographics. And if I don't say more about that in the book, it's because I feel other people already have covered it. But it's still the case, if you look at indicators simply for today's young, they still seem to be more complacent. Now, they may in some sense, quote unquote, grow out of that. And Japan moves from being the world's go-go economy in the 80s to just a few years later being quite placid. And they don't age more quickly than any of the rest of us. So I don't think aging is the main part of the story. It's one part of a multi-factor story.
Right behind you, the gentleman had hand up, and then.
Hi, Andy Vitos, ISMB. My question is, so you touched on it a little bit there. Would you not think that the election of Donald Trump is sort of a first sign of breaking out of the complacency? I mean, as well as globally, Brexit and the nationalist movements?
That's certainly possible, but keep in mind, Brexit is about returning to the past. Donald Trump make America great again, not the new shiny vision on a hill. He talks about infrastructure. It's never about the smart grid and the Hyperloop. It's first thing you hear is repairing our bridges, roads, and tunnels. I'm not opposed to doing that. But that to me is a strangely passive idea. And what we see on the ground is not actually much domestically is getting done. Foreign policy, I don't know, might be a very different story. He seems to me, I call him the placebo president. Talk of change, delivering, keeping all entitlements the same, and the churn of complacency will become grander and grander. I said this to Peter Thiel not too long ago, by the way.
But not what he's doing, but why he was elected, right? The people that elected him, those groups.
Some of them wanted real change, some of them wanted a kind of faux change, where they could feel they were doing something for change, but nothing actually was going to.
Joe Chang, Professor of International Business at George W. Just wanted to comment on a few remarks made, specifically a point earlier about the institutional aspect of it. Some of the conversation seems to be either cultural or institutional. The first one I would make is very often it's a combination of all the cultural, individual mindset and also the institutional environment. But just to give some illustrations of the institutional aspect of it, I spent 3 years recently in Australia doing research on innovation and national technology policy in Australia. And one of the things that they also talk about is the concept of people not being willing to take risk. And then if you dig deeper into it, there's a major issue that the business people are talking about is that the law, the bankruptcy law, basically has something to do with if you are running a new startup, a new business, and then you get into trouble, you can be subject to a criminal prosecution. So criminal, that means you will be going to jail. So that is one aspect that they were talking about. Is there something in the law that they can change to encourage entrepreneurship? And then in Japan, a few years back, they changed the bankruptcy law to lower the penalty, if you will, for bankruptcy. And then once they changed the law, there was an uptick in the startup business, particularly from people who are very highly educated and people who have a very high industry experience. So not so much that the quality of startups goes up, but also the quality of the entrepreneurs coming in goes up. And then the last one I'm going to make has to do with China. I think in China you see that there are really 2 or 3 different layers of innovation or lack of it. If you look at the lower level, people are really struggling to be economically more prosperous. So they are really into innovation and creativity. But then you look at the upper echelon, particularly the political system, it is still very much complacent in the sense that they are still accepting, protecting the status quo. So I think there are really different dimensions for us to look at China. It's not just one homogeneous aspect. There are many dimensions to it that we may need to take a closer look at. Thank you.
I would very gladly deregulate much, much more. I'm still interested in the cultural puzzle of why this won't happen. We literally don't have the resources, the physical manpower to deregulate what we would need to do. When you look at the Trump like 2-for-1 executive order, it's not really going to make much of a difference. The Communist Party in China does try to limit and slow down different types of change, but they do like build a new country, every 7 to 10 years. So they only succeed so much. You can go back to China a year later, 2 years later, and many things will be quite different in the same place.
So there was a hand up here before Kevin. Yeah, right here, and then Kevin, and then I'll go here, and then I'll go here.
Hi, I wanted to see if you saw a link between complacency, lack of innovation, and sort of how our public education and basically K through 12 education system has gone from sort of very few standardized tests and a more holistic approach to education to a ton of standardized tests and a focus on STEM, pretty much to the exclusion of the humanities.
I haven't studied standardized tests. My intuitive impression is that it is consistent with the complacency story, that everyone has to be above a certain line. You try to minimize variance. That has a lot of upside too. But it seems to me we're probably actually not taking enough chances with our education, and we're making it more cookie cutter, is my impression from a distance.
Well, I want to just try to make sure we have enough time. I got 3 more questions, and then I want to give everybody on the panel one last chance. So, Kevin.
Okay, Kevin Finneran at the National Academy of Sciences. I'm required by contract to say that research, of course, is the answer to all our problems, even though we know better than that. But I was curious about, it seems to me complacency is one way of looking at what we see, sitting from where we are in Washington and having good, well compensated jobs. But isn't it also, how does it look if it's at an age of anxiety? If you've just gone through the housing mortgage crisis, if you have tremendous uncertainty about healthcare and how it's going to be paid for, and you don't understand a big new system, you know that the cost of higher education is going up, and that you're taking on enormous debt to try to see your kids go to school. You see a world where you're afraid, you're unwilling to take risks, but how you respond, I think, could be very different, and I think we see that in the election. Sure. So I wonder if you look at all of these forces that you talk about that I think are real, how would they look politically different if you're at a different place on the social ladder? And if Ed Luce, who's written terrifically about India, would add some comments about how India falls in the spectrum of anxiety or complacency and so on, I think would be interesting.
They only let me put one main word in the title, which is complacency. There is plenty of fear, but there's 2 ways you can respond to fear. One is to dig yourself in and make things safer and safer, which is what many Americans have done. The other is more, as you see in China, it's like, oh, things are risky. I need to take even more risk. That's the only way of coping with this risk. And that we haven't done. So I guess I view complacency as a bit more meta than fear. But I agree there's plenty of fear. And it's also fear of crime, going back a few decades earlier, is a motivating force behind this. Absolutely.
Ed, you want to add it?
Yes. The India question is a good question. If you look at surveys, world attitude surveys of India is amongst the most optimistic countries in the world. It's all to do with not where you are, but where you're going. And I think, as Tyler would point out, that India doesn't need to do very much to grow quite healthy rates for the next 2-3 decades. It's still only 2/3 literate. It's not that difficult to make it 90-95% literate, but it will keep growth going. 50% of food rots before it gets to market because the roads are all weather. It's pretty easy to pave roads and to have cold storage, logistics, chains, etc. So there's a reason for Indian optimism. At independence, life expectancy was 32. Now it's 67. We can get it up to 80, 81, 82. So there's a lot of reasons for optimism because there's so much progress to make.
Right here, and then one more question.
Yes, Barrett Caldwell. I'm a professor of industrial engineering at Purdue as a Jefferson Science Fellow at the Department of State this year. And so I guess I'm representing that middle of the country that you were sort of vaguely talking about. I want to push back and get to something that Michael said about people getting up to complacency. They're not complacent. They want, that's an aspirational goal to be complacent. And if you're an entrepreneur and you're experiencing a lot of desperation, if you're a machinist who's looking at a loss of a job, there's some desperation there. If you're one of my STEM engineering students, they are hoping to get a job. They are not yet at that complacent stage. And I'm wondering what you would say about the roles of technology or education or simply access to a social standing as agency to deal with this fear, not just, oh, automatically you're going to get to complacency. Complacency would be aspirational for a lot of people who are of color, of a different minority group, who are risking a loss of their identity or occupation.
Sure. Again, keep in mind the complacency is at a meta level. It's referring to the notion that many people can't even imagine a future very different from what they see. And even those who can, they don't feel it's such an urgent thing to bring that future about. It doesn't mean that, say, you're never rushing through traffic to make a delivery for your job, or it's at, the broader societal level. How accepting are you of what you've grown up with? And in that regard, I think America is a much, much more complacent country than, say, it was in the 60s or 1970s.
Okay, last question, lady right here.
Hi, Erin Smith with the Bipartisan Policy Center. I primarily work on energy innovation, so that will be the focus of my question. Over the past 8 to 10 years, there's been a fair amount of institutional innovation at the Department of Energy, such as the creation of ARPA-E, the Energy Innovation, or the Energy Frontier Research Centers, and the Innovation Hubs. They've been fairly successful at investing in high-risk, high-reward research. However, because they are government institutions, they are naturally risk-averse because they're working with taxpayer-funded money. So my question to you is, what role do you see these having in our innovation and complacency struggle?
I can't speak to those particular programs, but when I look at energy, I see that in some areas wind power really works, but it's very hard to erect it because of NIMBY attitudes. And furthermore, nuclear power, not for all of our energy, but for a significant portion, is completely green. France has done it for many decades. It can be done. We've solved the green energy problem a long time ago, well before the complacent age, I might add. And we're simply unwilling to do it because we think it's not that big a deal. It won't be that bad, or we don't even know what we think. It's not seen as very urgent that we address climate change. And people think, oh, it's only the Republicans, only U.S. I really don't think that's true. I think it is most of the world with this attitude, perhaps a few small island nations aside.
Maybe we could address it without having to do anything.
Maybe.
So let me go down the line from my left, Rehan.
Gosh, I think that we've covered so much ground. I'm sorry to say that I don't have any broad or deep thoughts about this complacency dilemma, other than to say that if you haven't bought Tyler's book already, you must. If you've only purchased one copy, I urge you, or share them with your most complacent friends. Thank you for it.
So don't be complacent about buying the book. It's on the back there. So, Michael.
Well, I think there are two kinds of societies in the world, two kinds of economies. There's the low productivity, high workforce growth countries, as China and India is pointed out. And then there's the developed countries, and they have very high productivity. The OECD productivity is like 4 or 5 times higher than that of Chinese and Indian workers. So we're actually very productive, but very low workforce growth. And I think So GDP being a compound of these, naturally, if you have applied fairly low productivity technologies to rapidly growing workforces, your GDP is going to rise real rapidly. So I just think that we should focus not on economic growth defined as GDP, because the workforce growth is going to be fairly limited, even with the most generous immigration policies that you could realistically imagine. And we need to focus on the labor productivity. And here again, I just would state my disagreement with Tyler. I think this is largely a matter of the right institutional arrangements with business and government and research universities and regulatory agencies and so on, and getting a political bloc that can promote this. And I think that will be different in different countries, ultimately for political reasons, and culture is part of it. But I think politics can't just be reduced to culture.
Right. I don't have grand thoughts, so I'll smuggle in an anecdote since others have talked about childhood. My parents lived through the Blitz generation, so they're a very, very high tolerance for risk. And when I was a child in the early 70s, aged 4, my mother would allow me to walk across the fields for about 2 miles to see my best friend. So we were living in the countryside, aged 4 or 5. I would walk regularly, he would come the other way, and nobody thought anything of it. My daughter is 10, and if I told my mother now this is the same person, that I was going to do what she did to me and send her off to boarding school, at age 7 in my case, she'd probably call the police. Even if I told my mother, look, this boarding school is not going to be like the one I went to. There will be food fit for human consumption. The showers won't be ice cold, etc., etc. She'd still probably get very panicked and worried about her granddaughter's future. This is the same person in the same lifetime, so it's not just generational. And I don't think this is just a function of aging. One of the things that has happened, and I'll leave with this completely abstruse thought, one of the things that has happened since I was 4 and my daughter was 10 is these explosion of really, really disturbing paedophile scandals in Britain. And I think our consciousness, in a way we're all Dick Cheney now. There's the 1% doctrine, namely that if there's a 1% chance Al-Qaeda is going to nuke you, you must assume it's 100% likely to happen. I think we're all like that as parents now and as grandparents, and that is a huge change.
Rob, forgive me, I just want to add one quick thought, which is that when you look at a lot of the turmoil the world is likely to face over the next 10, 20 years, I would argue that more cohesive, more solidaristic, more egalitarian societies might be less creative, they might be less individualistic and innovative along some dimensions, but they also might be better placed to get through some of that turmoil. If you look at the last 20 years, it's striking that countries like Germany and Australia, just a little bit more egalitarian, just a little bit less individualistic, in some ways have done a better job of managing this transition to a more integrated global economy. And I don't think that's entirely coincidental. The United States, our great strengths have always been our individualism, the rich variety of subcultures that we have, and yet that's something that might make it harder for us to navigate some of what's to come.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is, super important conversation to have, and Tyler, congratulations on the book, and I hope it gets a lot of attention that it deserves. But more important, I hope it launches some kind of debate about, what are we doing? Trumpism is some kind of response to that, but I don't think it's quite the right response. How do we essentially establish big goals for the nation that essentially say we're going to take bigger risks across a wide variety of wide swath of our society and our economy? And how do we get all the major players in that ecosystem, the business, other groups, institutions like higher education and healthcare to start to take big risks to get to a better future? So I think that your book is a wake-up call for that. And so thank you for joining us. I want to thank our 3 great panelists, and I want to thank all of you for joining us. So thank you.
Late for an interview, so I don't really talk. I don't. Is the
Hopefully.
Yeah, they want to wonder
It was. I wasn't this year on my 12.
Okay, yeah, I'll put the top of the cap.
What he talked about was trying to keep issues to a half-time job.
Oh, yeah, yeah. Awesome. Thank you.
And